If the files are really public, why does half the page feel like it's been erased on purpose? Because once redactions become the story, you're no longer looking at paperwork. You're looking at power. And if multiple administrations, FBI directors, and lawmakers all brushed against the same thing, the real question is who was protecting it. That's the part nobody wants to say out loud because it turns one scandal into a machine. And once you see that machine, everything changes. So let's get into it. Bro, the wildest part is they keep saying the files are public while half the page is missing. That's not public, that's a teaser trailer. And when people at the top act nervous, you know something ugly is buried. Like nobody panics over paperwork unless the paperwork is doing cardio. The redactions are the story, not the press conference. Exactly. Because once lawmakers start saying co-conspirator out loud, the temperature jumps. And why are so many agencies acting like this all came from nowhere? That's the part that smells bad to me, the long trail of delay and blame shifting. It's always not our fault until somebody opens the drawer. Then suddenly everybody becomes a fan of process and procedure. But if multiple administrations had pieces of this, who exactly was protecting what? That question is doing a lot of heavy lifting right now. Because the second you hear Bush era and multiple FBI directors, this stops being one scandal. It starts looking like a machine. And people hate that word because a machine means it wasn't accidental. Accidental is such a cozy word for rich people crimes. Yeah, like, oops, my influence leaked all over the federal government. What gets me is the immunity deals and the one-person punishment story. Thousands of victims and one accomplice? That's insane. That ratio alone makes people suspicious. Unless there were reasons, but then show us the reasons. That's what I keep coming back to. Why keep the co-conspirator section sealed? If names are there, somebody doesn't want those names breathing in daylight. And once a congresswoman says she's sending a long list to oversight, this gets real. Oversight is the only word in Washington that still sounds vaguely dangerous. Usually it just means people yell into microphones and then fly home. But here, the documents actually seem to be the pressure point. That's why the bipartisan angle matters so much. When both sides start smelling blood, the usual shield breaks a little. Or they perform outrage and quietly bury it again. Yeah, that is the annoying part of being alive in 2026. Still, the fact that Republicans and Democrats are both talking cover-up is not nothing. It means the documents are too hot to ignore, or too explosive to control with one talking point. And now the public wants the whole thing, not another filtered summary. Which is fair because once you hear redacted enough times, you assume the worst. Especially when the excuse is basically, we got it that way from someone else. That's the bureaucratic version of don't look at me. And then you get the bigger issue, which is trust in the institutions. Because if the DOJ, FBI, and Congress all knew pieces, who was the adult in the room? Apparently no one, which is deeply comforting. America's finest tradition, shared responsibility and no accountability. But I do think the victims are the center here, or they should be. Because every time this turns into elite gossip, the human harm gets pushed aside. That's why the file release matters more than the drama around it. You either want sunlight or you don't. And if you don't, your reasons better be very, very good. Because privacy starts sounding suspicious when the powerful are involved. Especially when the story keeps touching billionaires, politicians, and agencies in one breath. That combination is basically catnip for cover-up theories. Not theories, sometimes just very ugly reality. And I get why people jump to intelligence links because the secrecy feeds it. But the core issue is still simple. Who knew what and when? That question should not be this hard to answer. If the paper trail is real, stop hiding behind formatting and release it. Exactly, because every redaction makes people assume there is a name worth protecting. And Washington never protects boring names. Right? Nobody's burning careers over a guy named Todd from accounting. The scary part is that the system may have normalized protecting status. Like if you're famous enough, you get a softer legal reality. That would explain a lot, honestly. And it also explains why lawmakers are talking about the greatest cover-up language so aggressively. They know people are already thinking that. Once the public believes that, every denial sounds weaker. Which is why this is going to drag on forever. Unless somebody actually dumps the clean files and lets the public judge. That would be the only move that resets the whole thing. Not spin, not selective leaks, not another hearing montage. Please, no more hearing montage energy. I can't take another room full of serious faces pretending this is normal. Yeah, because normal would be the files out, victims heard, names examined. And if the files exonerate people, fine, let that happen in daylight. But if they don't, then the cover-up becomes the bigger crime in the public mind. That's the point where institutions lose the argument entirely. Honestly, they may have already lost it. The problem with hiding a lot is that people start imagining more. And sometimes the imagination is only slightly worse than the reality. So yeah, I think this story is less about one man now. It's about whether the powerful can still be exposed at all. And if they can, this is the test case everyone's watching. Which means we're going to hear transparency 10,000 times before we see any. Classic American preview package. Yeah, and somehow the actual answer is still in a folder somewhere. Which is already suspicious because why is a folder doing more work than agencies? If the files exist, the public should see the clean version, not a magic trick. And the crazy part is everyone sounds shocked that the redactions are still redacted. That is the whole scandal, not the press conference around it. Because once you say some documents and then hide the important names, come on. That's not transparency, that's stage lighting. And the weirdest part is how many institutions were supposedly involved. DOJ, FBI, multiple administrations, all of them somehow claiming the same innocent confusion. That is a lot of people to accidentally all become unavailable at once. Very busy week for accountability, apparently. And if there really are co-conspirator references, that is not a small detail. That's the part people keep circling, right? Not just who went to the island, but who helped keep the machine running. Because that is a completely different conversation. The public kept being sold the tourist version, and the actual story sounds industrial. Like a network, not a scandal. And networks are always harder to prosecute than one monster in a cell. Which is probably why people keep asking for the unredacted files. Because everyone is tired of getting the same polished nothing. Polished nothing is basically Washington's core product. That should be on their logo somewhere. But I get why lawmakers are making a show of it now. If they saw even partial files, they know how explosive the missing pieces are. And once you say we saw names, people are going to want names. You can't half-announce a cover-up and expect people to calm down. That is how you make it worse, honestly. But I also think some of this gets overcooked fast. Like every missing line becomes a secret empire in people's minds. Sometimes it is, though. Fair, that's the problem. The real issue is that the burden of proof keeps getting shifted to the public. As in, trust us, we reviewed it, while the evidence stays locked away. That never works anymore. Not after years of agencies being caught lying, spinning, or just stonewalling. And now they're asking people to believe the story is simple. Nothing says simple like a giant stack of black bars. Do you think this is actually about justice for victims, though? Or is that becoming the moral shield for a bigger political war? It can be both, and that is the nasty part. The victims deserve every document, every name, every answer. But politicians also love a righteous cause when it hits their enemies, especially when the enemy is already unpopular. Then the whole thing becomes selective outrage with good lighting. Still, if there were plea deals and immunity deals, that matters a lot. Because that means someone made choices, not mistakes. And one person in jail is a wild ending if the network was bigger. The math is not exactly reassuring. What gets me is how the public senses hierarchy in all this. Like if you're rich, famous, connected, the rules suddenly get foggy. And if you're nobody, the rules are very crisp. That is the oldest story in the book, just with worse branding. The problem is people do not just want punishment now. They want to know how this was allowed to survive for so long. That's the scarier question, honestly. Because if the answer is institutional protection, then the scandal is structural. And structural scandals never die quickly. No, they just get renamed every few years. That's why the foreign and pressure angle and elite connections angle keep popping up. People think the story is being shaped by forces bigger than normal politics. Some of that is probably internet paranoia, let's be honest. The internet does love a shadowy hallway. It absolutely does. But even without conspiracy fan fiction, the secrecy itself is real. And secrecy is what gives the louder theories oxygen. If institutions were boringly honest, half the mythology dies. Instead, they act offended that people are suspicious. That's my favorite part, the fake insulted face. Like, come on, you created this entire mood. And the more they delay release, the more it looks intentional. Even if some names are protected for legitimate reasons, nobody trusts that anymore. Because the default assumption is cover up first, explanation later. Which is a terrible place for a democracy to be. Especially on something this ugly. The victims get dragged into politics, the institutions get dragged into disgrace, and the truth gets buried in procedure. And then everyone acts like procedure is neutral. Procedure is just power-wearing glasses. That is annoyingly good. But if this really turns into more hearings, more document fights, and more names, good. Maybe the pressure finally gets too high to keep skating. Or they give us a tiny release and call it closure. Which would be insulting. Very on brand, though. Brutally on brand. I just keep coming back to one thing. If they did nothing wrong, open everything. If they did, keep hiding and watch the fire get bigger. That is not a great strategic fork. Not at all. And that's why this story keeps gnawing at people. It smells like something being protected. And once that feeling sets in, everything becomes evidence. Even silence becomes suspicious. Especially silence. Silence is doing a lot of heavy lifting here. Honestly, more than half the system. So yeah, I think the release fight is now bigger than Epstein. It is about whether public truth can still beat elite insulation. And right now that contest is looking very ugly. But at least the ugliness is visible. Which is probably the first real step. Visible ugliness is still ugliness, though. The weird part is how many people suddenly sound surprised. Like the file had a mystery label on it for years. And now everyone is pretending they just found the basement door. The basement has always been there. What gets me is the redactions inside the redactions. That is such a loud way to say, do not look here. Right, because nothing says transparency like black rectangles. And then they expect people to trust the process after that. Trust is not the product when the file looks edited by fear. But do you buy the claim that this is just standard data handling? Of course they said that, because it sounds administrative. Bureaucracy is the best costume for panic. Still, the co-conspirator section being fully redacted is the real issue. That is not a small omission. That is the whole story missing. If the public already knows enough to be outraged, why hide that part? Because names are where the system starts sweating. Facts are fine until they become dinner party guests. The claim that multiple administrations touched this makes it uglier. That is where I stop thinking this is one bad actor and start thinking architecture. And that's the part people keep circling around, right? Not just what Epstein did, but who made it possible to keep going. Which is always the scarier sentence. Because one man having that much access is already insane. But an entire chain of institutions letting it happen is worse. Do you think people are underplaying how much elite protection matters here? Absolutely, because wealth buys delay and delay buys amnesia. Delay is basically a legal skincare routine. It keeps the face smooth while the rot works underneath. That sounds dramatic, but it's kind of the whole point. And yet every time there is a new hearing, people act shocked again. Is that real shock or just performance? A little of both, probably. Some lawmakers want truth, and some want to be seen wanting truth. The second group always has better lighting. But the victims do not get to live in lighting. That part is what actually matters. The victims are being used as moral cover while the documents stay sealed. And that creates this gross political theater around justice. Everybody is suddenly an advocate when cameras show up. The compassion comes out on a timer. But the release argument is actually simple. Let the public see the evidence. Unless the evidence is incomplete and weaponized by omission. That's fair. But then what is the alternative? More controlled release, with real accountability for the redactions. Not this weird half-open drawer nonsense. Half-open drawer is the perfect description. It invites suspicion without actually resolving anything. Which is why conspiracy thinking grows in that vacuum, right? Exactly, because where institutions refuse clarity, people build their own. Usually with worse spelling, but still. Sometimes with excellent instincts, though. The problem is that a real cover-up and a fake theory can coexist. That overlap is what makes this so hard to talk about responsibly. And people use that complexity to avoid saying anything at all. Which is cowardly when the stakes are this high. Because if co-conspirators were investigated and not charged, that is huge. That's not a footnote, that's a giant missing chapter. And if immunity deals were part of the machine, who signed off on them? That is the question that keeps pulling this away from one scandal. It starts to look less like a scandal and more like a maintenance program. A maintenance program for the powerful is a terrifying phrase, because it implies the goal was not justice, but stability. And stability for who exactly? For everyone at the top who benefits from nobody asking follow-up questions. That includes the media too, to some extent. Yeah, because some outlets love the headline and hate the digging. The headline is profitable, the truth is cumbersome. Truth always needs more staff than clickbait. And the public can feel when something is being skimmed over. That feeling is part intuition, part pattern recognition. People are not dumb, they just get fed a lot of selective nonsense, especially when political tribes decide which facts are usable. That part is miserable because then truth becomes branding. Imagine branding this issue, that's actually sick. But that is what happens when accountability gets folded into partisan war. So how do you keep the victims centered in a circus like this? By refusing to let the powerful become the main characters. And by treating redactions like a clue, not an endpoint. Basically, read the blank space like it owes you money. That's actually a great line. Because the blank space is where the fight really is. And if the DOJ keeps saying the source data made them do it, what then? Then someone has to explain who curated the source data in the first place. That chain matters more than the excuse. Explanations without ownership are just fog machines. Very efficient fog machines, too. Do you think this ever reaches a real breaking point? Only if people keep forcing the issue after the cameras leave. Because the system is counting on attention moving on. And that is the oldest trick in the book. The book is basically a manual for disappearing outrage, which is why persistent pressure matters more than one viral moment. Viral outrage is fast. Accountability is stubborn. That is annoyingly true. Unfortunately, yes. And if there really are names in those files, the public deserves the rest of the story. Even if it makes powerful people uncomfortable. Especially then, honestly. That is the test, right? Whether discomfort still counts as a reason to tell the truth. It should not, but history keeps acting otherwise. History is such a coward sometimes. Which is why this cannot end at release. It has to end at accountability. And if accountability never comes, then the public learns another lesson about who the system really serves. Yeah, and that lesson is not exactly uplifting. No, but it is useful. Because once you see the pattern, you stop pretending it is accidental. And maybe that is where real pressure starts. Finally, a hopeful sentence that does not sound fake. Yeah, because the minute people stop buying the performance, the spell weakens. And the spell has been doing work for a long time.